where what was previously parking spaces and general carriageway has now been set aside for the local restaurant, so they can outside in a way that's consistent with social distancing. So, as I say, COVID really has encouraged people to think more radically. And again, we're encouraging that very much in the tools we're developing in more. So this is an example of another tool we're providing where cities can decide on their user priorities and how much space broadly they want to allocate to different types of street users. And this tool simply shows different ways in which you might be able to allocate that space in cross-section, whether you have the buses next to the curb or on the centre of the road, we have a median strip and so on. Again, just to encourage local authorities and the various stakeholders to think more innovatively about how that space could be used. Similarly, we then go on and look at modelling, and this is Visin, PTV Visin tool. But what's happened as part of this project is gone into more detail on looking at the curbside uses, to pay more detail to the simulation of curbside activities and to provide some new output measures of efficiency of curb space use, ease of finding a space, and potentially, if the curb is being charged for, how much revenue a local authority might expect to obtain. Also, there's more emphasis on place activities, actually modelling people stopping to chat or queuing or sitting and so on as being important aspects of the use of streets in our cities, generally with a view of looking at how we can use the limited space in a more dynamic, efficient and flexible way. As well as that, we're also turned attention to two particular issues that we think are quite challenging. And the first is to do with how we regulate the use of street space in cities. The way we tend to do that at the moment is to be rather reactive. So, as you will be aware, many cities over the last couple of years have had to face up to the new e-scooter mode. But often cities have been on the back foot. The private sector has introduced a mode and then the cities have had to think how to react. What we're suggesting in more is that cities become proactive and indeed generically develop regulations of what activities are allowed on different parts of the streets. So, for example, if we say we have a footway area, we have a sort of cycle type lane area, we have a carriageway, what would be the performance envelopes for different modes that we would accept on those different parts of the street? So there might be a speed limit, there may be a question of whether you need lighting, whether you need protection, things like that. With a view to saying that if local authorities can do that, it makes it much easier to plan and manage the streets, also to use particular materials on different parts of the streets. And if a private sector partner is coming in with a new idea for a mode, then in a sense, they can be tailored to one of those three sets of performance regimes, so that they'll fit into the desired landscape of the street rather than challenging it. And the other area is the whole question about using LED signing and lining. To get the most use out of streets, it might be that different times of day we want to use different parts of the street in rather different ways. So, for example, at some times part of that street might be a footway for pedestrians. At other times it might become part of the carriageway, either for moving traffic or for loading and parking. So how can we actually do that in a safe way? Because obviously we can't put physical obstacles in as we would if it was a permanent feature. So how can we do that in a flexible but a safe way? Secondly, how can we be sure that the electronic signs and road markings are actually correctly operating and are fully visible at all times under different lighting and weather conditions? Thirdly, how do we actually record traffic regulations as they're operating at a particular point in time, in a way that if somebody contravenes one of those regulations, in court it'd be possible to be clear about what was the sign or the line showing at that time. So something that would be enforceable. And probably the biggest challenge of all is how to handle transition periods from one set of regulations to another. For example, somebody may be in a parking bay that we want to make into a loading bay, or more challenging, somebody might be driving in one lane on the carriageway, and then we decide that because of a build-up in traffic, we want to make that a bus lane. How do we ensure that that transition is run smoothly? So that's a quick overview of the challenge we've set ourselves. If you'd like more information, please either contact me or go to our website, www.roadspace.eu. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks, Peter. I'm really enjoying being involved in the MORE project myself. So thanks for that overview. And we now have some time for questions, and I've seen lots of activity happening on the screen, which has been testing my multitasking skills to the limit. May I ask for our lovely panelists to rejoin the show, as it were, and I'll start throwing some questions in your directions. Brilliant. Good to see you all again. I've made a note here, a question for Örebro. I pronounced that differently. To Per and Lovisa. There was a question from Natasha, and she asked regarding the traffic modelling, whether or not you also considered the environmental impact, so things like air quality or noise, as part of that data. And I suppose linked to that, were there any other elements of the cost benefit analysis that were there? I think we're thinking there about there's all the decarbonisation objectives, net zero carbon. Did that have anything to play?
We didn't do any kind of simulation of example, for example, air pollution. Nowadays we have I think we measure air pollution 1 point. We're discussing about, we're also working on a digital twin, and I think we're discussing a bit how we could integrate, for example, air pollution, noise pollution in that digital twin. But so as far as I know, it hasn't been integrated yet, and we haven't done that kind of analysis so far. But Pero has one thing to mention about a health perspective.
Yeah, I can just mention that's not about the BRT project itself, but it's about fulfilling our targets for model split. Then we did this PASTA research project a couple of years ago, which showed that if we reach our targets, it would save, I think, 44 lives a year or something like that. So because of active travel. So that's an important aspect as well. But as Lovisa said, we have not calculated so much of the other effects, but I think it's a good idea to do.
Lovely, thanks. Yeah, the social benefit, obviously important. And just sticking with both of you, you showed some lovely images of your desired vision for BRT. Did you draw inspiration from any other cities in Sweden or elsewhere? Sort of medium-sized towns.
Yes, or in Sweden, it's counted as one of the 3 biggest towns. But Malmö, we draw inspiration from. We also looked a bit internationally. So the working group did this kind of study trip to Metz, Nantes, and Strasbourg in France. A trip with both civil servants and politicians to get to see some kind of practical examples. We also had our boss got a scholarship for studying BRT in Medellin and Bogota, Colombia. So we have drawn some inspiration from other places as well.
Lovely. Yeah, those are all strong examples. And just whilst we're talking, I had a question, which was, what's been the response so far in terms of citizens and businesses, their reaction to these proposals for BRT? Have you done a consultation? Are they fully in support, or are you getting a bit of backlash as well?
It would be really news if they were fully in support, everyone in the city. We're doing this communication work that is actually kind of launching. I think it's launching now. That is more towards the real estate owners and business owners. But it's also a bit tricky. And now this situation with Corona, where everyone, I don't know how they're balancing on this. I think we have to focus on yeah, there will be a new normal, and we will be able to go by bus later. But there's also been this kind of a citizen signing up the traffic rebellion that thinks that why do you reduce the possibilities for cars?
Yeah, it's a challenging,
not just applause.
challenging moment. Yeah, no, it is a challenging moment, I think, for all cities with stakeholder engagement, because it's difficult to base the future on the current situation and things like social distancing. Lovely, thank you for that.
I can just add that what you just said,
Yes.
Paul, that our visualization, I think, have been an important tool in that communication. Yes, there's some sort of storytelling, how will it be in the future? Otherwise, it's quite hard to understand why it's necessary to take away space from cars and give it to public transport and so on. So
yeah,
I think it's one of the main points in our presentation is just that.
Yeah, so the strong vision is more important than ever when the current situation is a bit strange. Yeah, definitely. Cool, thank you very much for that. I have a question here for Klara and/or Sara, which was regarding, you used the term hybrid professional, the hybrid professional concept. The question was, could you elaborate a bit more on what that means? Does it mean public and private sector? Does it mean engineer stroke planner?
Yes, it can mean both those things. So I can try to elaborate a little bit. So it's not a new concept. It stems from the new public management and when the new public management reforms were implemented. And the classical example is a doctor also became a manager. So they had to combine different logics in their everyday life. And then it has been developed. So now it's also in large collaborations, for instance, where we have to combine different interests. We have to see what is best for the project and then also what is best from my perspective, my profession. So in that sense, it incorporates quite a wide sense of combining different logics. And so the classical example of a hybrid organization would be public operation that is doing best for the city, but also has some kind of business responsibility. And so it's been used in a lot of different sectors now, but it stems from this business and public value profession and management in a way, which kind of stems from 80s and 90s.
Lovely. Thank you for that. I think that answered the question that came in earlier. What else do we have? So jumping over to Alan and Kevin, and in Rotterdam, there were a few questions there. I think that the last slide, the last couple of slides, the Hoekstra, pilot. There was you showed the user rate of 20 to 35% of the alternative mobility solutions, I think, which you commented it seemed quite low. What does that mean, do you think? Does it mean that the residents were walking instead or using public transport instead? Or, yeah, I wonder how they still were able to complete all their journeys without necessarily using all the shared options.
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. I think it's a logical one also, and the answer is not so straightforward. I think it has to do with a couple of things. First of all, it was the first pilot we ran in such a way, so people need to get aware of it, people get used to traveling in this way. But besides that, it's an area which is located relatively within the city center. So that makes the availability of public transport quite high. And for that reason, people might have made all their journeys actually with public transport, or maybe by foot or by bike. And that's also maybe to grab another question which I saw in the chat directly also, the reason why I think that it was mostly used, the vehicles within the hub for trips that went to areas which are not so good accessible by public transport, which is in general positive point. Of course, the hub also is there to promote the sustainable ways of transportation. And as long as people can get along by public transport within the city or close to the city, well, it's perfect with us.
Yeah, so if the hubs are sort of enabling public transport as well. Question for Kevin. Shall I repeat?
Yeah, I'm afraid I didn't hear the question, Paul.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, who provided those mobility services? Were they private operators? Was it the city? A mixture?
Well, the interesting thing is that actually the initiative came from the inhabitants. So we've got an organization called the City Lab, which actually initiated this challenge also, and of course they came to us as a municipality to facilitate them in order to be able to run this challenge.
Wow! So they also provided some funding for that.
Sorry.
So they also provided funding for that. I don't know. I'm not sure if it's my or yours, but I'll move on. Not to worry. There were some other questions on that, which there are answers in the chat box. A question for Alan. Also, some questions on the hub methodology and sort of how it projects and that the hub methodology, will that nationwide? Will it be a standard, for example?
I didn't hear what you said, but I think you repeated the questions that are in the chat, so I'll try to answer that. The project in which we developed this topology is it's not just one road project or so. It's from the innovation and the general knowledge that we saw. There are lots of typologies already and lots of hub developments, for example, for train stations and bike, that combination. But we found out we didn't have much knowledge about hubs directly from the highway system going into the city system. So we decided to do some research so we could get some knowledge about that as well and combine it to the projects we are having. And we're facing also from the municipalities and provinces that have come to us for collaboration on the highway system part. So it's more a general knowledge project than an actual that it's linked to a road project or so. And we also decided that that this is the typology we use and we find very useful. But there are, of course, more typologies around, and we contacted the people who made them as well. And together we said, well, it's not worth the effort to have one typology for the whole country that everyone is working with. We know what the strengths and weaknesses of each typology are, and we concluded that they don't conflict. So we just leave it there. I think it's the best.
Nice, thanks, Alan. And then there was a theme in lots of the presentations and making the most efficient use of limited space. A lot of you used the term density and increasing density as part of the future. And then we've seen lots of designs of streets that, in some cases, like the one in Nijmegen, where you have different modes accommodated on different levels, which I thought was really interesting. You know, the super block principle in Barcelona and Vitoria, where they decide to have different mode priority on different streets. So there, they say that all streets don't do all functions. But taking the Nijmegen example, you've got like one corridor, but you're getting everybody through the corridor on different modes because you have potentially these different levels. So I just wanted to explore that a bit more. Jasper, do you think it's still a proposal, but do you for you know, at different levels, maybe using the geography to their advantage?
Yeah, your connection does seem to be a bit spotty, but I think I got most of your question. I think if you make the comparison with for instance the super blocks in Barcelona, of course I think in a lot of cases that is what you want. You don't want all these different modes in the same locations in many areas. But of course the main issue is that you do want all these modes to be connected. And I think the main locations where you want these modes to be connected is, for instance, at the major train stations. And that is where you do come into problems in actually combining all these modes. And then I think what we're actually trying to achieve here in Nijmegen does some solutions in some cases. But of course it is something that you have to use sparingly, because all these different levels, they do also create different environments that may make it in terms of experiencing it and keeping it on the human level, really, that can be quite daunting then, of course. So plus of course if you look at many cities in the US where you have these elevated highways that go straight through the city, that does a lot with your cityscapes and with the way your cities actually take shape. So I don't think that's something that we want in many European cities in the same way, and that, at least if I talk for Nijmegen, that's not what we envision. So we do really want to keep that human scale and that human interaction in place. But it's just in some locations, even if you go for areas where maybe cars are not allowed and cars are allowed, and the same goes for buses and cyclists and pedestrians. Even when you do that, there are still locations where they will all come together, and those are needed to actually be able to switch between these modalities. So in those locations, yeah, it's always a way of actually trying to fit all these different transport modes into one environment, and that can be a big puzzle. And that's a puzzle that we've dealt with in Nijmegen for a long time, and that now we have some ideas of actually trying to solve while still, and that's also something that I hope from the pictures was clear, also being able to add a lot of spatial quality in a lot of area that people can experience a lot more strongly than they can at the moment, where there's a lot of asphalt and a lot of stone environment, where now we're actually able to add a lot of green areas, and yeah, so it can be a far more pleasant environment for everyone.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jasper. We've got a few more minutes. I just wanted to end with Peter. Similar topic, really. From the MORE project, what are the findings so far about, you know, the future organization of streets, the allocation of space, the most effective allocation of space? How do you see street designs in the future? You're on mute, Peter.
Sorry about that. I think there's two things. First of all the pressures on the street be different. So already we've seen e-scooters being quite a challenge in many cities. So with the growth of things like Uber, the greater pressure for drop-off pickup spaces and so on. And on top of that, if we get drones on, or bots, I think they're called, actually on the footway, so there were those extra challenges. And how will we deal with that? Well, I think probably in most city streets, we currently see a very clear demarcation between the footway and the carriageway. We have a raised curb, and that's quite limiting on the extent to which you can move things around. So I think we'll end up with a slightly more blurred distinction between what's footway and what's carriageway, so that at different times of day we can allocate those differently. And we see a lot already, for example, in London, in places like Camden Street near Camden Market, we have very wide footways now, quite narrow carriageway. And up till 10 o'clock in the morning, when there are very few customers, then loading is permitted on the footway. But after that time, as the customers build up, there's no more loading. So I think we're starting to flex between the carriageway and the footway. I think that will come more in the future. And obviously, ideally, spatial segregation, if you can do that vertically, is helpful in some situations. But we often have these problems of utilities. Underneath, we have water, electricity, gas, and so on. That's really very, very expensive to mess around with.
Lovely, thanks, Peter. Nice to end the show with. We've ended on time, which in my experience is a miracle. So can we give a big virtual round of applause to our speakers? And if you do want to network with anybody, there's the networking function down here. So click on that. And otherwise, have a nice lunch and enjoy the rest of the day. Goodbye.